in our last class, we had been talking about the paper Introduction to Philosophy and specifically discussing Unit 4, which was to do with social and political philosophy, the concept of justice, and the scientific temperament. We continue our discussion further in this theme. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, this paper, which has been introduced to the first semester UGCF NEP syllabus students for the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, talks about some of the primary readings and the secondary readings of this paper, Introduction to Philosophy. The readers that we have picked up are Pritchard, Thomas Brooks, and D.P. Chattopadhyay. As much as Pritchard talks about epistemology or knowledge or social and political philosophy, we see Brooks talking about justice and Chattopadhyay talking about scientific temperament. Now, if we try to connect the theme of certainty versus doubt, with Pritchard we see that he encourages doubt, as reflected in the PPT here. Brooks accepts disagreements, and Chattopadhyay seeks reliable certainty through science. About the diversity of views, for Pritchard it is multiple philosophical methods, for Brooks it is multiple justice theories, and for Chattopadhyay it is science that evolves but remains rational. Now, in the dimension of what it teaches, for Pritchard basically how to think, Brooks how to be fair, Chattopadhyay how to think scientifically. The nature of for Pritchard is analytical, justice for Brooks is normative, and scientific temperament for Chattopadhyay is empirical. The goal for Pritchard is clarity, for Brooks it is fairness, and for Chattopadhyay it is truth. Risk for Pritchard is over abstraction, for Brooks it is disagreement, for Chattopadhyay it is over rationalization. Now, if we see the strength, we see of Pritchard it is critical thinking, for Brooks it is ethical guidance, and for Chattopadhyay it is practical progress. Now, further, the core aim of what is this thing called philosophy of Pritchard, it introduces nature and methods of philosophy. The thinking it through, it engages with contemporary and philosophical problems, and to think it makes philosophy accessible and engaging, and critical thinking it teaches logical reasoning and argument analysis. Further, under the first component, we see what philosophy is and how it works. The second component, how philosophy applies to real life issues. The third component, the big philosophical questions in simple terms. And the fourth is about how to think clearly and critically. The approach of the first is analytical and structured. The style is academic but accessible. For the second, the approach is dialogical and issue-based. The style is conversational and reflective. The third, it is narrative and explanatory. For the style, it is reader-friendly and illustrative. And for the last, it is logical and skills-based. For the style, it is introduction and systematic. We see that again the main themes, knowledge, skepticism, reasoning, mind, ethics, identity, society. For the first two, truth, knowledge, self, morality, arguments, fallacies, reasoning for the last two. Similarly, the type of philosophy, meta-philosophy and epistemology, contemporary analytic philosophy for the first two. Similarly, general introduction to philosophy and logic and critical thinking for the last two. Further, if we talk about the methodology, we would see that something which is, what is this thing called philosophy? It deals mostly with thought experiments, and it is also to do with conceptual clarity. And similarly, the thinking it through, it is to do with case studies, examples, reflections. To think, it is to do with analogies and everyday examples, and to critically thinking, it is to do with formal logic, argument, evaluation. Similarly, questions, as we understand in philosophy, is an integral part, and the role of questions for the first is to do with, which is central to philosophical inquiry. The second, it explores real world dilemmas. The third, it encourages curiosity. And the fourth, it frames problems logically. For the view of knowledge, in the first, we see that it requires justification and clarity. For the second, it is contextual and problem oriented. For the third, it is explanatory and open ended. For the last, it is based on valid reasoning. Again, for engagement with reality, we see with the first, it is somewhat abstract. For the second, it is highly practical and relevant. For the third, it is moderately practical. And for the fourth, it is highly practical and skills based. The strength, if we are to note down, it is strong conceptual foundation. For the second, it relates philosophy to everyday life. For the third, it is easy to understand. And for the fourth, it develops reasoning skills. Limitations, it can feel abstract. The second is that it is less focused on technical rigor. The third is that it may oversimplify. And of course, the last is that it less focuses on philosophical depth. So, to sum it all up, for Pritchard, what is philosophy is a method of critical inquiry. For these other philosophers like Appia, it is a tool to analyze real issues. For Blackburn, it is a way of questioning life, and for Moore, it is a skill of reasoning. The primary concern, again for Pritchard, is understanding knowledge. For Appia, it is solving philosophical problems. For Blackburn, it is exploring big questions. For Moore, it is evaluating arguments and to relation to life. For Pritchard, it is indirect. Appia, it is direct. Blackburn, semi-direct. And Moore, of course, direct practical skills. Now, amongst all these four primary readers that is recommended, or rather secondary readers that's recommended in this unit, we see that the use of examples in Pritchard is limited and abstract. For Appia, it is the real world cases. For Blackburn, it is the everyday illustrations. And for Moore, the logical examples. The focus on logic for Pritchard has been moderate, similarly like Appia. For Blackburn, it is low, and for Moore, it is extremely high. Focus on ethics and society, for Pritchard, it is moderate. For Appia, it is high. But just like Pritchard, Blackburn is also moderate, and for Moore, it is low. Now, if we talk about the nature for Pritchard, the dimension is conceptual. For Appia, it is applied, and for Blackburn, it is introductory, and for Moore, it is skill-based. The goal has been clear. For Pritchard, clarity and thinking. Appia, understanding real issues. Blackburn, accessibility. Moore, logical precision and the strength, the philosophical depth for the first. For the second, practical relevance. Third, simplicity. Fourth, analytical skills. Limitation for the first is abstract. For the second, less technical depth. Third, simplification. And fourth, less philosophical breadth. So, we see that the social contract theory explains why we form societies and governments. It imagines a state of nature, life before society, and argues that individuals agree, explicitly or implicitly, to give up some freedoms in exchange for order, security, and cooperation. For Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature otherwise is violent and chaotic, war of all against all. And his famous phrase, by which we all are acquainted with, is life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The social contract for him is that people surrender rights to a strong sovereign, Leviathan. The main core is Hobbes prioritizes security over freedom. The contract is almost irreversible. Similarly, for John Locke, the state of nature is relatively peaceful but insecure. There are natural rights, yes, life, liberty, property. Government exists to protect rights and dominate. If government fails, people have the right to revolt. This introduces accountability. For J.J. Rousseau, we see that the state of nature is free and equal. Society corrupts humans. The social contract creates the general will, which is the collective good. And freedom is not lost. It is transformed into moral and collective freedom. Now, if we see the conceptual depth from the primary reading of Pritchard on these themes of social contract theory in his what is this thing called philosophy, he states that social contract theory illustrates, number one, thought experiments vis-a-vis state of nature, normative reasoning, which what should be the basis of society, and a tension between individual autonomy versus collective authority. The critical issues, he says, is the contract real or hypothetical? Does everyone truly consent? What about marginalized groups, historically excluded? So, again, in the PPT here, we see that the state of nature for Thomas Hobbes, it is violent, chaotic. For John Locke, it is peaceful but insecure. For J.J. Rousseau, it is free, equal, simple. The view of human nature for Hobbes, it is selfish, fearful. For Locke, it is rational, cooperative. For Rousseau, it is naturally good. The purpose of contract for Hobbes is security and order. For Locke, it is protection of rights, and for Rousseau, it is collective freedom. The type of government for Hobbes, it is absolute monarchy. For Locke, limited government. For Rousseau, direct democracy. Similarly, the aspect of rights for Hobbes, it is surrendered completely. For Locke, it is retained, the natural rights. For Rousseau, it is transformed into collective rights. Freedom for Hobbes, it is sacrificed for security. For Locke, it is protected. For Rousseau, it is achieved through general will. The right to revolt for Hobbes, it is absolutely no. For Locke, yes. And for Rousseau, yes, indirectly. So the key concept of Thomas Hobbes is Leviathan. For Locke is natural rights. And for Rousseau, it has been the general will. So we see that the question, what does it mean to treat people fairly under justice? In Tom Brooks' work, What is Justice? He explains that justice is not a single idea, but a cluster of competing theories. Some of the major theories of justice, he says, is the distributive justice, which is concerned with fair distribution of resources, example, wealth, opportunities, and the idea is that equality versus fairness. Should everyone get the same or according to need or merit? For Rawls, the original position plus the veil of ignorance, the principles have been equal basic liberties. Inequalities allowed only if they benefit the least advantaged. The nuance has been that justice must be impartial. We design society without knowing our position in it. For Robert Nozick, the libertarian justice, who focuses on individual rights and property. Justice, he says, is just acquisition plus voluntary transfer. The idea, he says, it rejects redistribution, and taxation may be seen as coercion. Retributive justice is concerned with punishment, the idea that the wrongdoers deserve punishment proportional to their crimes. Restorative justice focuses on repairing harm. It emphasizes dialogue, reconciliation. For Brooks, again, we see that justice is thus, it is not one fixed concept, it is context dependent. It often involves balancing competing moral claims. And the important insight is that there is no single universally accepted theory of justice. Now, for Pritchard, from what is this thing called philosophy, he shows that justice shows how philosophy clarifies concepts, tests intuitions, uses thought experiments, or the veil of ignorance. Now in this PPT here, we see the justice theories comparison, the core idea of Rawls, justice as fairness, Robert Nozick, justice as entitlement, Tom Brooks, justice as a plural concept. The focus about equality and fairness in Rawls, individual liberty in Nozick, and Brooks's multiple perspectives. The key principle for John Rawls is the veil of ignorance. For Nozick, it is just acquisition and transfer, and for Brooks, it is context dependent. The role of state for Rawls is active, redistribution. Nozick, minimal state, and for Brooks, flexible role. View on inequality for Rawls, it is allowed if benefits least advantaged. For Nozick, acceptable if justly acquired. Tom Brooks, it depends on context. The strength for Rawls, it protects the weakest. Nozick, strong rights protection. Brooks, inclusive approach. Criticism, it is too idealistic. Nozick ignores inequality, and Tom Brooks lacks single definition. So we see that when we talk about the scientific temper, it is a way of thinking. It is just not knowledge of science. And D.P. Chattopadhyay defends scientific temperament as a commitment to reason, evidence, critical inquiry, and openness to change. Some of the features of scientific temperament are: number one, rationality, where beliefs must be based on logic and evidence; skepticism, which is it questions traditions, authority, superstition; open-mindedness, which is willingness to revise beliefs when new evidence arises; empirical orientation, knowledge grounded in observation and experimentation. So scientific temper is especially significant in India, and it has been promoted by a lot of scientific philosophers, and they have been linked to modernization and democratic citizenship. It is not anti-tradition, but critical engagement with tradition. The philosophical depth is that the scientific temperament connects to epistemology, how we know, and philosophy of science comes up with something like what counts as scientific knowledge, difference between science and pseudoscience. Some of the philosophers who have been, or the thinkers who have been associated, are Karl Popper through his falsifiability theory to explain science, where he says that a theory must be testable and refutable. Thomas Kuhn, who says that science evolves through paradigm shifts. And the main takeaway is that scientific temperament is not static. It evolves with scientific practice. If we see the PPT here, we see that the main basis of scientific temperament is evidence and reason based. For the traditional or the dogmatic thinking, it is belief and authority. For the attitude, the first scientific temperament is questioning, and dogmatic is acceptance. The method of scientific temperament is experimentation. For dogmatic, it is ritual, custom. Flexibility, open to change for the former, resistance to change for the latter. Knowledge source, observation, the other is tradition. Outcome is progress and innovation. The second is stability, but stagnation, risk. Similarly, for the thinker D.P. Chattopadhyay, the contribution is that he defended scientific temper. The key idea is that it is rational and critical mindset. For Karl Popper, it is the falsification theory, that the testability of science. Thomas Kuhn, it is paradigm shift where science evolves, and for Nehru, it is promoted in India by scientific temper for nation building. Now, when we talk about the various types of justice, distributive, retributive, restorative, procedural, we see that if one talks about fair distribution of resources, the other talks about punishment for wrongdoing. If the former talks about repairing harm, the latter talks about fair processes. If the focus of distributive justice is equality and equity, retributive is marked by justice as desert. Restorative is reconciliation and procedural is transparency. Some of the examples could be for distributive welfare policies, retributive criminal punishment, restorative victim offender mediation, and procedural fair trials. So we see that these three topics are deeply interconnected. Social contract talks about justice. Social contracts aim to create a just society. Justice defines whether the contract is fair. Justice, on the other hand, further talks about scientific temper. Justice systems increasingly rely on evidence rationality. Scientific temper prevents bias and superstition in law. Scientific temper is social contract, where a modern democratic contract assumes rational citizens. Scientific temper strengthens informed consent and participation. Now, we see that in the work, what is this thing called philosophy? Pritchard argues that philosophy is shown as conceptual clarification, argument analysis, critical reflection on everyday ideas. These topics illustrate how philosophy engages with real-world issues, how abstract thinking shapes politics, law, and science. To revisit the social contract is to do as to why society exists, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Justice is about what fairness means, Rawls, Nozick, Brooks, and the scientific temperament is how we should think, Chattopadhyay and Popper. So, to sum up now, if we are to explain the scientific contract theory with reference to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, we should be in a position to answer that the social contract theory is a foundational concept in social and political philosophy that explains the origin of society and political authority. It suggests that individuals living in a pre-political state of nature voluntarily agrees to form a society and establish governance. For these, Thomas Hobbes, who describes the state of nature as chaotic and violent, wherein there is no authority to enforce laws and humans are naturally self-interested, can be talked about. Conflict for Hobbes is inevitable due to competition and mistrust. To escape this, individuals surrender all rights to a sovereign authority. So Hobbes prioritizes security over liberty, leading to authoritarian implications. John Locke again presents a more optimistic view with the state of nature as relatively peaceful but lacks impartial justice, and government is created to protect these rights. We see that the key idea of Locke is limited government with accountability, and he introduces the right to revolt, making political authority conditional. With Rousseau, he sees that the state of nature as free and equal but corrupted by society, and the social contract creates the general will. The collective sovereignty and moral freedom is there, and one of the insights of Rousseau's theory is that freedom is redefined as participation in collective decision making. So the social contract evolves from authoritarianism of Hobbes to liberalism of Locke to democratic collectivism of Rousseau. It remains a powerful framework for understanding modern political systems. Now, to address the second possible question as to how would one critically examine the concept of justice with reference to contemporary theories, we can sum up by stating that justice concerns the fair distribution of benefits and burdens in society. Contemporary discussions, especially by Tom Brooks, highlight that justice is not a single idea but a plurality of theories. Here, roles justice as fairness, the original position where individuals choose principles behind a veil of ignorance, with the concepts of equal liberty, and inequality is justified only if the benefit the least advantaged can be mentioned, and the strength is to ensure fairness and impartiality, and criticism is too idealistic and abstract. Similarly, there is Robert Nozick's libertarian view. There is also the distributive justice and the restorative justice. We also see that justice is thus a dynamic and contested concept requiring continuous philosophical reflection and adaptation to social realities. And the last part, if again we are to revisit then that how do you understand a scientific temper and discuss the philosophical and social significance, we should be in a position to state that scientific temper refers to an attitude of rational inquiry, critical thinking and reliance on evidence rather than blind belief. And some of the definitions and core features of Dipi Chattopadhyay's, where rationality means beliefs must be logically justified, skepticism is where questions of authority and tradition, empiricism is dependence on observation and experiment, and open-mindedness means willingness to revise beliefs ought to be mentioned, and philosophers like Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn should be also elaborated. So, this was our discussion today on Unit 4, where we have talked about the social and political philosophy vis-a-vis the concept of justice. Also, we have talked about the social contract, and last but not the least about scientific temper. And we have also tried to show how the social contract, justice and temper are interconnected to each other. Thank you so much.